Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Hall, Chief Curator and Director of Collections at the Frick Pittsburgh. Thanks so much for pressing play on this video, which is part of our four-part series on the Frick family's summer home, Eagle Rock, was located on the North Shore of Massachusetts. As we all work from home, we've been gratified by the response that we've gotten to our efforts to continue to provide content related to our collections and the stories we tell at the Frick. And I want you to know that we really appreciate the fact that we are connecting with people while we're working from home and while most of you are spending a great deal of your time at home as well. So this part 4 that I'm doing is the finale, so to speak, of 4 episodes that we've put together. Part 1 was by Dawn Breen, our Associate Curator of Decorative Arts, and she talked about the design, construction, and use of Eagle Rock. Part 2 was our Director of Learning, Amanda Gillen, discussing the domestic staff and what kind of work was required to support life in a luxurious 100+ room mansion. And part 3 was by our assistant curator of the Car and Carriage Museum, Kim Cady, and she talked about the stables and the garage and these outbuildings and the folks who worked there and the use of cars and carriages on the property. So I'm wrapping this up by talking about the traces of Eagle Rock that we have that remain, which are mainly collection items, some things that you might be surprised about, and help us to paint the picture that we can paint of Eagle Rock and what life was like there. So bear with me for a moment while I do a screen share and start my slideshow for you. I'm going to pull up the images and we're going to minimize me so that you don't see me while we're going through the slideshow. So what we're looking at right now is the cover of the 1907 inventory of Eagle Rock. You can see that they did things with style. And if you were opening up that inventory, everything in it is listed as perfect. In 1907, August of 1907, it's the second summer after the house has been constructed. So it's a new house, but as we know, not all of the furnishings were new. So perfect, even for old master paintings and antique furnishings purchased by Henry Clay Frick, is probably a bit of an overstatement. But it's inventories like this one and the wealth of correspondence and archival material we have access to through the Frick Art Reference Library in New York that help us to piece together the stories we tell and allow us to do this bit of time traveling we're doing. I think one thing we learn working with history and working with historic houses in particular is that things are never static. Here we have our own inventory here in Pittsburgh, and as this slide says, Eagle Rock is all around us. We're always trying to discover more about the life of the objects in our collection, where they come from, and how they have moved as part of this family story that is not static and changes from day to day. It tends to be trickier. If you look at this list, 138 Chinese porcelains, 13 pieces of French furniture, a lot of decorative arts, and it tends to be a little bit trickier when we're tracking the decorative arts because they're not as well documented as the paintings. So what do we have? You can see a little bit of Eagle Rock by the numbers on this slide, but you might be surprised we know we have some very large things. We have the grand entry gates with Henry Clay Frick's monogram that used to be at Eagle Rock. We have 17th century English paneling that forms our Jacobean room, so basically a whole room from Eagle Rock, to very small things like the miniature porcelain collection that Henry Clay Frick bought from George B. Warren of Troy, New York, and had installed in custom-made cases at Eagle Rock. And we love to take those out and display them similarly. In fact, if the museum were open, you'd be able to see them on display right now in that way. We sometimes find things out from about objects and their past from file notes. Sometimes there are tags attached to objects that will say Eagle Rock or even you know, north wall eagle rock, really specific indications of where an object used to be. We use the inventories, as I mentioned before, and we have some photo documentation of the interior of the house, and you'll see that later on in this slideshow. So that all helps us. Here, I couldn't resist using this detail of Little and Browne, the architects of Eagle Rock, this gorgeous drawing of the rendering of the fence details. And you can see here the limestone swagged urn and carved baskets of flowers. If you've been to the Frick Pittsburgh and walked through the gates that enter our grounds, you've seen those. It's really fun to look at this. It's a fence that is so impressive, it receives mention in the New York Times during party coverage there. And now we're going to look at the entire image of the Little and Browne drawing of the grand fence for Eagle Rock. It's kind of a before and after image here, because you have the Little and Browne rendering, and then you have a photograph of our entry gate. And there you see at the top of the brick pillar, the limestone carved swagged urn there, just as you see in the drawing. And this little sort of image collage, and I apologize for not having captions on every image, but it's more to give a sense of an array of objects and quality here. Clayton is on the left at the top and Eagle Rock is on the right. And these are examples of artworks that traveled between the two. So traveling with your art collection is something that the Fricks did. And once they had a private train car, they could use their private car to do that. This is really sort of pre-1914. 1914 is the year that the Frick collection in New York is completed, the Frick residence at that time, obviously not a public museum. And once the family resides there, their back and forth to Pittsburgh is a bit less frequent. But before 1914, they're living in New York beginning in 1903, and Eagle Rock is completed in 1906. So there's a lot of sort of rotation of artworks from place to place, and they used a train to do that. Most of the art we associate with Clayton is listed on the 1931 Eagle Rock inventory, so we know a lot of the contents of Clayton that had been historically there was used at Eagle Rock, in addition to these transport records that we have. It's the 1950s when Helen Clay Frick starts bringing things back to Pittsburgh. She starts imagining what a house museum and a historic site could be located around her birthplace. And so things start coming back in the 50s. A lot of this artwork that regularly moved by train included the Millets. You have one image here on the slide of the mother carrying the child on the rustic path. Henry Clay Frick has assembled one of the greatest collections of Millet works on paper in the US. We have some fabulous things, and those went back and forth from Clayton to Eagle Rock, as well as his Barbizon paintings, an example of which the Rousseau down there at the bottom left corner. Many things, including the pair of Reynolds portraits you see at the right, and our Monet. I'm going to take a look at some of Henry Clay Frick's late purchases, really fabulous things that he bought in the last couple of years before his death in 1919 that hung at Eagle Rock, but actually were inherited by Helen because she inherited the contents of Eagle Rock at her father's death. And so they are part of our collection. This fabulous Arthur Davis conversation piece, which would be very familiar to any viewers who have also been visitors to our collection, as well as Francesca Guardi's view on the Grand Canal of Saint-Germain. It is a really fabulous example of Guardi's work, just a painting that you can be totally wrapped by as you examine the details. One of my favorites in the collection. So now we're going to do a little bit of back and forth comparisons between interior views of Eagle Rock and objects in our collection. So you can see here the breakfast room at Eagle Rock with a Chippendale style mirror and 18th century French console. And indeed, on the right, there's a photograph of the Chippendale style mirror and the 18th century French console in our collection. I always tell the story about that piece of furniture. We were doing an exhibition on the objects in our collection with provenance from J.P. Morgan, and I got a sheaf of papers from my colleagues in New York at the Frick Art Reference Library detailing purchases through Duveen from the Morgan collection. And it described, one of the receipts described this piece pretty well enough that I went to the file and was looking through the file and looking at the piece to try to confirm that it was the described object. And in fact, it was the key to the drawer. There's a secret little lock hidden on the front of that, and the key was labeled Mr. Morgan. So that was the final confirmation that indeed it was the right piece of furniture. And here's another interior image of Eagle Rock, and so many things. I'm sure I haven't even circled everything in this image that is now part of our collection. The Circle of Lawrence painting over the fireplace, which hangs at Clayton right now. At the center is the fabulous Japan Secretary. It's a British cabinet with some flourishes that look very Florentine, but done in this Japan style. And it's an astounding example, and it was purchased on the recommendation of Elsie de Wolf, originally for Henry Clay Frick's space at the Frick collection. And it was there for some time, and the family moved it to Eagle Rock at some point, and it is now part of our collection. The Louis XVI style custom carved Steinway grand piano there on the left is in fact the piano we use regularly at the Frick Art Museum for concerts and performances. And then you can see the paintings that are above the piano in this photograph. On the left is Gainsborough's portrait of Richard Brinsley Sheridan, another one of my favorites in the collection, which was a late purchase of Henry Clay Frick's from Eagle Rock that now resides with us in Pittsburgh. And the William Beechey portrait attributed to Beechey, which of Princess Sophia, we think. That's who the sitter has been identified as. And that also currently hangs inside Clayton. And in this image, you see the Davis, which I had as a separate slide a few images back, hanging over the mantle. There's a really interesting mosque lamp on top of the piano. It was probably made in Syria, and it's really lovely, and was part of this eclectic decorating. Henry Clay Frick is hiring various people. Duveen does a lot with the interiors at Eagle Rock, and that's really the beginning of his relationship with Duveen. And it's really the beginning of the idea that these interiors need to be of the same level as his painting collection. So this is when the objects that enter Henry Clay Frick's collection are a little different than what we have at Clayton. At Clayton, Henry Clay Frick and his wife Adelaide are a young married couple who are, like many young married couples, shopping for beautiful contemporary things. The things in Clayton are typically of the time period. And this is when Henry Clay Frick starts looking not just at old master paintings, but at fine and decorative art that is of high quality and shares the same kind of historical merit as his paintings. You can see in the center the beautiful French writing table attributed to Martin Callan that's in our collection in Pittsburgh, as well as the bronzes and the Chinese vase on top of that table. And the Commode Bombay, all the way at the left, the French Rococo piece, topped by a wonderful Chinese punch bowl. Those are also objects in our collection, as is most of the French furniture in this room. Just a few other things here in the stairway. Henry Clay Frick used a lot of the 18th century Mezzo Tints that he had bought from Knoedler Galleries, and we have that collection. They're really quite beautiful. The Mezzo Tint technique was a way of reproducing paintings that could more accurately than other forms of printmaking mimic the sort of tonal richness of a painting. So even though Mezzo Tints are black and white, they have these velvety deep blacks and this wonderful tonal richness. And so I'm quite fond of that Mezzo Tint collection as well. And there, hanging as you go up or down the stairway, is the view of Venice by Felix Ziem that is in our collection as well. And perhaps one of the more fun things, I talked before about the 17th century English paneling. Here in the large color image is a view of our Jacobean room. And there in the inset, you can see the way it was installed at Eagle Rock with Henry Clay Frick's Murillo on the wall there to the right. So as I show this slide, I would say, warning, don't send me your vacation pictures because you may, in fact, end up in a presentation. So this is my former colleague, Amelia, who made a pilgrimage to the site of Eagle Rock. So while the house was downsized in the 1930s and taken down in the 1960s, the stables remain, and parts of the sort of monumental entrance and fencing remains. So you can see here this limestone archway, really grand, with Eagle Rock inscribed on it, and this ornate person gate entry that corresponds to the design of the fencing that we have. Move on here, you can see the stables, the two-story stables that were converted in 1990 into condos. And I really like these images that I found on the internet. A landscape architect, James O'Day, who was hired to restore a section of the grounds to their 1911 landscape design. So it's wonderful to know that the owners of the property, the current owners, are working to restore the landscape as well. I'm sure it's very, very beautiful. I'm just showing this slide from the New York Times, August 1912, giving a little sense of the kind of activity at Eagle Rock. If you watch Dawn Green's part one of this, you'll get a better sense of all the activity that went on at the house. But this H.C. Frick's Party Draws Thousands is pretty fascinating, and I'm going to read you an excerpt from it in just a moment. But I wanted to have my final image be this 1905 sort of romantic view of Eagle Rock taken by Helen Clay Frick. The house is not yet completed, but you can see how impressive it is up there on the bluff overlooking the water. I often describe Helen Clay Frick as a preservationist, and it's because of her work to preserve, expand, and understand her father's collection and the world in which it was formed that we have that collection, and we have the resources that we have to tell the stories we tell, to make connections to the past that we're able to do today. So what I'm going to do now is read you, while you look at this evocative image taken by Helen Clay Frick in 1905. I'm going to read you the description of that party in 1912. Then I'm going to pop back to me on the screen to say goodbye and thank you one last time. So just kind of get yourself in the mood here to conjure the spirit of Eagle Rock. It was an event which caused more talk than anything ever attempted on the shore. Stories were published that the Frick's invitation list totaled 1,000. However, nearly 400 enjoyed a concert by Sousa's band in the late afternoon and early evening, and a dance which lasted until after midnight. Thousands gathered outside the big iron and stone fence surrounding the estate, but had to be content with a view of the people as they whizzed through the gates in motor cars. The crush of motor cars was so great that a squad of Beverly police had their hands full straightening out the tangle. Eagle Rock Mansion House is perched up high on Lookout Rock, one of the landmarks of the shore. The house is of brick with limestone trimmings, and the front entrance, semicircular in shape, is defined with 4 massive columns. Winding avenues lead to the house, and the estate itself, with acre after acre of velvet lawns, is one of the showplaces on the North Shore. It was on the water side of the estate, looking out on the Atlantic, that the party was held today. 4 tall Corinthian columns mark the entrance to the water side of the estate. It was about the terraces that the scene was the prettiest, with hundreds of beautifully gowned women making a picture of color and animation. In the evening, there was a charming display of Japanese lanterns of many shapes and colors, and these with strings of colored incandescents gave the terrace a fairyland appearance. So I'm back. And I think hopefully that conjured a wonderful picture for you of Eagle Rock and gave you a sense of the scope of our collection and the way we represent that story through the provenance of the objects that we have. I am just going to say thanks again for listening. If you have questions about this, or if there are topics related to our collection or Gilded Age history that you think that we might be able to help answer in a format like this or something similar, please go ahead and email us, info@thefrickpittsburgh.org. We're really good about answering emails. Again, I'm glad you took the time to watch this video, and thanks again, and take care.